Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Erin Blanton. I am a Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia SIPA. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Our panel is going to discuss zero carbon hydrogen use in today's energy system. Hydrogen is rapidly emerging as a key fuel to lower greenhouse gas emissions in critical sectors of the economy. Three primary pathways exist for making hydrogen today. What we call gray hydrogen is made via coal gasification or steam methane reforming, a production process in which high temperature is used to produce hydrogen most typically from natural gas. Gray hydrogen creates intensive CO2 emissions. Blue hydrogen is produced using the same method as gray hydrogen, but the CO2 emitted during the production process is sequestered via carbon capture and sequestration. And green hydrogen is produced by electrolysis of water using zero carbon electricity sources such as solar, hydro, nuclear, and wind. The hydrogen is produced by splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, and this makes hydrogen that is effectively carbon-free. If grid electricity is used, the emissions would be substantial, so zero carbon electricity is required. 10 million metric tons of hydrogen are currently produced in the United States every year, 95% of which is gray hydrogen, and the primary uses are in the oil refining and ammonia industries. Zero carbon hydrogen not only offers the opportunity to displace gray hydrogen, but as a fuel, it offers the potential to be used across our economy and in sectors that are the most challenging to decarbonize, such as the industrial sector, which remains the US's heaviest emitter. But production of zero carbon hydrogen needs to be brought to scale and costs need to come down significantly. There are also technical challenges to putting hydrogen in our current energy system. For example, hydrogen has 1/3 of the heat content of natural gas, which will require significantly more volume of hydrogen to be delivered to provide the same amount of energy. Therefore, we need policy options that overcome these commercial and technical challenges and allow zero carbon hydrogen to be more broadly adopted for use in industrial processes, transportation, and power generation. And this is why I am delighted that we are joined by these exceptional panelists, all of whom are working to find solutions to these questions and discuss the policies that will help drive wider hydrogen adoption in our economy. I would like to welcome Sherry Givens, Vice President of U.S. Regulatory and Customer Strategy at National Grid, Christine Wiley, Executive Director of the Hydrogen Technology Center at GTI, and Dr. Julio Friedman, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia SIPA. And hopefully we will be joined by Dr. Jack Brouwer, Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, Civil and Environmental Engineering at UC Irvine, and Director of the National Fuel Center and Advanced Power and Energy Program. First, we will hear from Sherry Givens of National Grid.
Thank you, Erin. I really appreciate the invitation and opportunity to join you today. For those unfamiliar with National Grid, we're an electric, gas, and clean energy delivery company serving over 20 million people across Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island. We're transforming our networks with smarter, cleaner, and more resilient solutions to meet the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions across our service territory. We believe in the science of climate change. That's clear. And we want to do our part as responsible business to ensure that we are mitigating the impacts of our emissions. Last October, we announced that we were going to have a net zero ambition by 2050. And we really see low carbon fuels like hydrogen as integral into pushing forward with that goal. So I'm really excited about this opportunity today to talk about some of our proposals, our partnerships, and our projects that we've done to date, and to answer any questions folks might have. So what have we done? What are we doing? We are really working with a lot of our partners across the US and in our region to really progress on some of our goals. We have, as I mentioned, we're going to be partnering with a lot of different industries and academia and others that are working in this area. We see our gas network as transforming. The molecules that we deliver to our customers today will not be the molecules that we deliver to our customers in 2050. Our network is an existing infrastructure that our customers have paid for, It's connected, it's delivering energy to millions of homes and businesses across our region. And we really need to focus on our customers, their bills, and their choices and their concerns. Getting to net zero is really fundamental to the transformation of our entire economy. And we believe that we can leverage our existing infrastructure to make the transition to net zero most cost effective. We want to decarbonize our gas network by scaling existing and commercially available technologies with low carbon fuels like renewable natural gas, and further lay the foundation for hydrogen in our economy. For over 40 years, we've been actually injecting renewable natural gas into our network. However, we know that RNG is not going to, from biomass, will not be enough to get us to net zero. And that's where hydrogen is going to come into play. We see hydrogen as the low carbon molecule for the 21st century. The potential is not there just to change our industry, which is delivering energy to heat homes and businesses, but it's also there to deliver change to other sectors of the economy, including transportation, manufacturing, power generation, and storage. And that's what makes hydrogen so compelling. The hydrogen economy has been talked about for decades. However, given recent technological innovations and the desire to move towards a net zero economy, the hydrogen industry has reached a point where the conversation is no longer just academic, but real projects are being developed around the world and in our region. So what are we doing? Who are we partnering with? One organization we're partnering with is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, along with Stony Brook University in New York for a first-of-a-kind demonstration in the US to study hydrogen blending and its impact on our local infrastructure. We're also proud to be partnering with the Center on Global Energy Policy on a new hydrogen program that'll tackle three core aspects of hydrogen development deployment: technology and economics, use cases and applications, and policy design. The program will engage business, industry, and government leaders by creating a new technology lab and developing various hydrogen roadmaps. I'm sure Julio will touch on it later. And we recently joined the Low Carbon Resources Initiative being led by GTI and the Electric Power Research Institute. This 5-year initiative is intended to focus on large-scale deployment of technologies, including those related to RNG and hydrogen, to 2030 and beyond, with over 30 utility industries and partners. I'm sure Kristen will be touching on that as well. Many of our stakeholders are not yet aware of the technology or how hydrogen can play a role in the net zero world. Therefore, we're going to continue to actively engage with them and work with them to ensure that all the appropriate policy and regulatory mechanisms and frameworks are in place to support technologies. Next, I want to talk to you about some of the proposals we have in our 3 states. We've made a number of regulatory filings with our regulators in Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island. In Massachusetts, we proposed a hydrogen production and blending campus study. In New York, we've proposed a hydrogen demonstration project for a multi-use hydrogen facility. The project would be in partnership with Standard Hydrogen Corporation, located in an industrial site with a carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration pilot. In Rhode Island, we requested broadening our current program to enable support of decarbonization programs, including hydrogen. From a policy standpoint, we're really looking at the frameworks that can support the scaling of RNG and hydrogen investment. We're looking at how market-based programs like renewable portfolio standards can be used to build supply and demand of these low carbon fuels. We need to consider standardization and streamlining of interconnection procedures. And we really need to think through policies that can help address the unique challenges of our cold weather climate. Next, I want to touch on some of our projects. We realize that we need to begin advancing hydrogen in the US to the same extent and development that we're seeing in Europe and other countries around the world. Recently, we shared the news that we are going to be working with the US Department of Energy on a new stand-up industry collaborative called the HyBlend Project. They have supported us with $12.5 million to stand up this new collaborative that's really going to support accelerated research and blending on hydrogen and into natural gas distribution systems. The funds will be primarily allocated to 6 national labs. NREL will be leading, and we'll be working on numerous areas of focus that will actually support our future of gas activity. Others involved include Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern Company, and Shell. We, along with our research partners, are going to explore performance of existing natural gas assets such as pipelines, storage, compressors, and even household appliances, when hydrogen is added to the fuel mix to allow us to find the optimal portfolio solution. The research will enable us as utilities to transition to hydrogen fuel while leveraging existing infrastructure. We believe that we can evolve our energy markets, including our gas networks, to serve a net zero future. What we've talked about here is how we want to build on the experiences around the world to look at new technologies, adapt them for what we need in our region, and continue to serve our customers safely, affordably, and reliably. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I really enjoyed the way that you focused on the partnerships that you're doing and the projects and the policy, like really focusing on those key areas. And so now I'd like to hand it to Professor Jack Brouwer, UC Irvine.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here. And I was asked to talk about the various ways in which hydrogen can be used. And this is one of the challenges actually with hydrogen, is that it can be used in so many applications that people lose focus of the features that it could actually provide for our sustainable and renewable energy future. I want to focus first on utility applications because it offers features that complement the existing resources that are on the grid, like battery energy storage systems and pumped hydro. These are very important resources for massive energy storage in the pumped hydro case, and then short duration storage in the battery case. But hydrogen offers the opportunity with separate power and energy scaling to have massive energy amounts, okay, that are stored for long durations of time. So whenever you have a large energy amount and a long duration of storage, that's where hydrogen shines. And as we introduce more and more renewables on the grid, we're going to need more and more of these massive energy storage resources and long duration storage resources. Secondly, hydrogen can be used in transportation applications. And hydrogen has features that enable zero emissions with, with different features than battery energy storage. What do I mean by that? If you have a short range, don't mind slow fueling, and don't have a big payload application, then batteries are preferred. But when hydrogen shines, when you have a need for rapid fueling, long range, or heavy payload. And so that's why you see hydrogen being discussed quite a bit with regard to its application in heavy duty vehicles, in ships or aircraft or long haul trucks or trains and things like this. I want to suggest though that because of infrastructure constraints, it might also have still a very significant role even in light duty applications in the long run. And again, it complements the delivery of this renewable energy content on the electric grid with a delivery that can go in pipes, okay? And sometimes, because you can have a fueling station serve a dense urban environment and meet the needs of thousands of fuel cell vehicles, it's easier to put that infrastructure in the long term than to put in all electric charging for that same group of vehicles. I want to say that hydrogen can also engender resilience, and this is a very important thing lately with the actions and challenges in Texas, but also that we have experienced here in California with PSPS events and the like. The delivery of renewable energy content underground in pipes is much more reliable than the delivery of electricity via wires. And so many jurisdictions, I think, will settle upon a solution that includes renewable hydrogen for a resilience reason. Let me finally mention that there are industrial applications that require certain things like super high temperatures, or that require a reducing gas, or that require the feedstock of the hydrogen chemical. These include things like steel manufacturing, the manufacturing of ammonia, which requires the hydrogen input, cement manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, computer chip manufacturing. And these kinds of things can be decarbonized with the hydrogen vector, but not easily decarbonized with other alternatives for introducing, for example, electricity, renewable electricity directly. I was also asked to talk a little bit in my 5 minutes about what's happening in California. And there are lots of things happening in California that include green hydrogen. Hydrogen is actually being dispensed in over 40 fueling stations throughout the state right now, primarily garnering green hydrogen from biogas, okay? And it's mostly landfill gas that's contributing to that renewable content in California. But we also have some demonstration projects for making green hydrogen electrolytically. There's a number of them that are ongoing with support from the California Energy Commission and others, which are making renewable hydrogen from solar or wind power through electrolysis. And these demonstration projects are similar to those that I heard Sherry describing earlier in other jurisdictions. These are just getting underway in most applications here in the state. I was asked to talk about one other topic. Oh, yes. This is a very important project, which is the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power initiative to transform what is currently a coal-fired power plant in Delta, Utah, which power we are delivering via wires all the way to LA. And they are decommissioning that coal-fired power plant and introducing pretty soon a gas turbine combined cycle plant, which is one of the modern, usually natural gas fueled power plants that are being used all around the world. It's the most popular type of power plant being introduced around the world. But their idea is to start with that kind of power plant fueled by a mixture of hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, and natural gas on day one, 30% renewable hydrogen going into that natural gas combined cycle plant. It's of course now going to be a natural gas and hydrogen power plant. They are making the hydrogen from sun and wind power in the local region, storing it in a salt cavern, again, a proven way to store massive amounts of renewable hydrogen, and then mixing it to 30% on day one, and then slowly adding the percentage up to 100% renewable hydrogen powered natural gas, I should say, gas turbine combined cycle plant by 2045. This is a pretty important idea because it has the opportunity to transition existing assets, which may be still very valuable to the grid, that are dispatchable, okay, converting them over time to a renewable dispatchable power plant. I want to have one caution about that though, because it's still combustion. And if you're in a non-attainment zone, you should think about the air quality ramifications of that idea, okay? So in Delta, Utah, maybe this is one of the best solutions. In urban environments that have pollutant concerns, I suggest that we transform those existing plants to fuel cell plants over time, in which case we can have renewable, dispatchable power that has zero greenhouse gas emissions and zero criteria pollutant emissions. This could also be done at Delta, Utah over time after that investment in the combined cycle plant is borne out. Those are my comments that I hope I touched on the topics that you would like me to. We've been doing lots of research at UCI also that includes many of the topics you talked about, studying the pipelines, putting hydrogen in the pipelines, putting hydrogen in these combined cycle plants. These are all demonstration projects that I've been fortunate to work on here at UCI and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about them.
That's great. And thank you so much, Jack. I know you had a lot to cover in a short introductory period, but I assure you we plan to get to some of those discussions of the demonstration projects and things as we go through the panel. So our next panelist is Christine Wiley at SIPA.
Great. Hi, Erin. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. I was trying to share a couple slides, but it seems to not be working.
Should be able to share your slides.
Okay, let me try one more time. Okay, great. Can you see them now? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so first off, let me say thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of such an impressive panel. And thank you to Sherry and Jack for really setting up a nice discussion around hydrogen and the opportunities that we have. It's really encouraging to see that we're aligning around this shared vision for our energy future. So really a carbon managed future where we have a much more integrated energy system that leverages not just our existing infrastructure, but also fuels as well as gases. So if we think about gas molecules, they're really phenomenal energy carriers. And so that's what makes hydrogen so very exciting and really offers another solution for decarbonization. So today I'm going to share some examples that demonstrate how we're working on developing low carbon, low cost hydrogen solutions. So in 2020, GTI launched our new Hydrogen Technology Center. And as what's been highlighted already, decarbonization is really a monumental challenge that's going to need an array of solutions and technologies. And hydrogen will be essential to decarbonizing certain parts of our economy. I think Jack touched upon that, right? When we think about heavy industries, processes that require high heat or are energy intensive, that's really ripe for hydrogen. So we're developing technology solutions for all parts of that hydrogen value chain. So make, move, store, and use. And we're doing this really through collaboration. So advancing technologies require scale, but also a diverse set of partners. And we need to innovate. We need to innovate in how we produce, deliver, and use energy. And we are in an energy transition. And so what we did in the past isn't going to work for a low carbon future. At GTI, we really benefit from a very rich history of hydrogen research. So our testing and demonstration facilities across that full value chain really enable us to create solutions that can be applied at multiple scales, whether that's looking at the residential sector or even larger scale power generation. So we have technologies to produce and generate clean hydrogen from biomass as well as from natural gas. We have ongoing research similar to what Jack presented on to address how to leverage our existing infrastructure to deliver hydrogen. And we have projects to demonstrate applications to use hydrogen, and very importantly, also looking at public and private partnerships to advance low carbon solutions, such as the California Fuel Cell Partnership, which is focused around building that market for hydrogen for transportation applications. So the path for decarbonization is complex, as you can see on this graphic here, as we shift from carbon intensive sources of energy to really low carbon solutions. So what this graphic demonstrates is we have multiple pathways and technologies to help us achieve net zero. Some of these we can implement today when we look at the integration of renewables like wind and solar. But as we look at others, such as clean hydrogen, that really presents a more long-term solution that needs R&D investment now so that we can deploy these solutions post-2030, which is part of the reason why we created the Low Carbon Resources Initiative that Sherry mentioned. So this is a partnership that we established with the Electric Power Research Institute, and it's a 5-year global R&D collaborative to advance economy-wide decarbonization. So we have 33 members and over $100 million in funding, which really shows the commitment from the natural gas industry and the electric industries and others when it comes to economy-wide decarbonization. So in this initiative, we're going to accelerate technologies from around the world with a focus on low carbon fuels like hydrogen, ammonia, biofuels, and synthetic fuels. So to enable a low carbon economy, we must expand our supply of low carbon fuels as well, such as hydrogen. So technologies that we implement need to be cost effective for a diverse set of customers, whether that's large scale power generation or serving disadvantaged communities. So we need disruptive innovation to produce a low cost supply of clean hydrogen, regardless of the color blue, green, turquoise, or the feedstock. We need it all. So we have a technology to produce low cost clean hydrogen from natural gas that uses a process with inherent carbon capture. And what that does is it dramatically reduces the capital expenditures as well as the overall levelized cost of hydrogen. And this technology is being piloted at our facilities in Illinois, as well as internationally in the UK with our partners at Cranfield University and Doosan. So hydrogen production from natural gas with carbon capture will play an important role in enabling a hydrogen economy now. As we transition to low carbon energy sources, we must be able to to get that energy where we need it and when we need it in an affordable, reliable, and resilient manner. I think you've heard similar comments from Jack and Sherry with regards to that. So our existing infrastructure provides just that. It encompasses not just pipelines, but also vast amounts of storage capacity. And it provides unparalleled and, very important to note, proven deliverability of fuels. So it ensures you can have that energy when you need it and where you need it, which really provides for our economy and our way of life. And we can use this to help support the broad scale deployment of hydrogen. So we're excited to be a part of one of the very first large scale demonstrations of a hydrogen network in the US. This is a recent project that's getting started. So with funding from DOE and key industry partners, GTI, Frontier Energy, and the University of Texas, Austin, will design and build and operate a hydrogen infrastructure network. And we're going to integrate on-site renewable hydrogen production, as well as using it in various applications like hydrogen fueling and backup power. So the team will also be looking to conduct a feasibility study for scaling up hydrogen production, as well as looking at existing resources like renewables, natural gas, prospective hydrogen users, and the delivery infrastructure such as existing pipelines around that Port of Houston. And that study will help develop strategic plans for building hydrogen networks, not just in the state of Texas, but also in other parts of the country, and really help advance hydrogen in our energy system. So what do we need to achieve this low carbon future? We need collaboration, scale, and intention. So we're very motivated to help shape that and accelerate that clean energy transition. And we believe that the moment for hydrogen is now. We're witnessing a lot of market changes, right, that signify this low cost, low carbon energy system. You know, you have a global race underway with countries implementing national strategies around hydrogen and decarbonization. So we really need to meet this moment with intent. We need to collaborate. It's very important in research. We need to incent scientific discovery and technological advances and really support disruptive innovations at scale. And so what this comes down to is increased public and private investment in energy innovation. So we're at a pivotal point here where our energy transitions need to positively impact economic growth, our quality of life, and global climate. So we really look forward to having continued discussions and collaboration with you in this energy transition. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christine. And it's great to see some of the practical ways in which you're trying to address some of these technical challenges. And so for our last but not least panelist, I hand over to Dr. Julio Friedman from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia.
Thank you so much, Erin. I'm delighted to be here, especially amongst such august and accomplished panelists. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes here talking about hydrogen technology and policy, really with an eye towards the present to 2030. What's the next 10 years going to really matter, and how should we spend our time? Let's start at the top. Net zero is the right framing for all this. Previous iterations in a hydrogen economy have always been about something else, like energy independence or clean air or manufacturing. This is different. Net zero is the goal, and it's hard to hit. And as Jack said, it is valuable to have hydrogen as an option. The second is that already the technology exists at a high level of technical readiness. We have steam methane reformers and autothermal reformers. We have electrolyzers. They are not deployed or scaled at the point to which we would like, but they exist. And we can improve the technologies for fuel cells and novel technologies like the ones that GTI is working on, but we can get started today with what we got. The applications are widespread, like Dr. Brouwer mentioned. I would be remiss if I didn't point out in particular shipping as an important application. You can't electrify ships. Just not going to work. And you need an energy dense fuel that does not emit as it runs. Ammonia looks pretty good in that context. And in that setting, low carbon hydrogen is going to be essential to zeroing out that sector. It can be used for other things. Well, I won't dwell on it. Hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss. There are two key challenges: cost and infrastructure. They are both substantial. They must both be conscious if we're going to make progress. Cost, the fundamental challenge here is that gray hydrogen is cheaper than the other options. Blue hydrogen, capturing the emissions associated with gray hydrogen, costs about 30 to 80% more than gray hydrogen. So there's a premium that no one's paying for today. Green hydrogen costs between 100 and 600% more than gray hydrogen in most markets. It's just a lot more expensive. So you need some policies to align markets to pay for that. I'll come to that in a moment. The second part is the limits of infrastructure. We can blend small amounts of hydrogen into existing pipelines today safely, but only small amounts. Somewhere between 5 and 20%, depending on the vintage and make of the pipeline, you hit issues. And that means that you need to, at some point, think about an alternative kind of infrastructure investment. The same thing is true, though, for things like green hydrogen. You can make it in a distributed context. That's awesome. You can use renewable resources to do it. You still need to build out a lot of transmission to really make that work. And that is particularly true if you want to use hydrogen for applications like heat. Just the heat load in the state of New York is 3 times what the grid can run. You would need to triple the capacity of the grid to make hydrogen for heat. And that's just one of the things you got to do, and that is proving difficult. We have limits at ports. Most ports are not configured to make hydrogen, disperse hydrogen, or receive hydrogen, or hydrogen-rich fuels. So we got to do that. That's a thing to do. We have to replace the engines. Some engines can use a blend of hydrogen today, whether they're gas turbines or things like a reciprocating engine on a ship. You can blend ammonia into that today. But to get to high levels of use, you really need to swap out those engines. That's an infrastructure investment. And with it, of course, the fueling infrastructure as well, which creates a bit of a chicken and egg issue. Thankfully, we know the recipe for this. The recipe for this is market aligning policies. Some of that is market aligning policies that stimulate innovation for some of the projects and programs that Christine has already mentioned. Some of it is really market oriented instead. Today, we can start with just extending and expanding existing tax credits. So for example, the solar investment tax credit, the wind production tax credit, the 45Q carbon storage tax credit, if these were expanded and extended, we would see more hydrogen coming into the market because it would be cost effective. We could also create new incentives, for example, a production tax credit or an investment tax credit for hydrogen production. That does not exist today. It's one of the things that congressional members are looking at, and that would certainly work. My expectation is you would need something on the order of 75 cents for blue hydrogen, $1 to $1.50 for green hydrogen per kilogram in order to really get commercial uptake and get a lot more projects. Finally, green procurement, completely different kind of incentive, but the government could just say, hey, we're going to start buying stuff that's made with green hydrogen. They could buy fuels that are made with green hydrogen today. Fuels refining is made with hydrogen. It could be made with green hydrogen, and the government could pay a premium for that. The Department of Defense buys 4% of the fuels in the United States. They could start with that. The same thing is true for steel. The same thing is true for chemicals. The government could buy these things in a way in which it establishes and supports a hydrogen market. I have so much more I hope to talk about, but that's it for now.
Thank you, Julio. I really, especially as you touched on some of the policies that we need to see ramp up the use of hydrogen in our economy. Again, for those who are watching online, my name is Erin Blanton, and I'm here with Jack Brouwer of UC Irvine, Sherry Gibbons of National Grid, Christine Wiley of GTI, and Julio Friedman of Columbia SIPA. We're discussing zero carbon hydrogen use into the energy system. We're going to move to a moderator discussion, and then we're going to open up to the questions from the audience in a bit. We have a number of those. For those of us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Sherry, as I noted that Julio did touch on what we should be seeing in terms of policies to ramp up hydrogen. But I'm wondering, in that same vein, what do you think state regulators and utility commissions need to be doing to promote hydrogen use?
They need to really understand it first and foremost. And I would have to say hats off to the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, National Conference of State Legislators. They're really doing a good job of educating our regulatory commissions and our state legislators to really understand what the possibility of hydrogen is. As Julio mentioned, the tax credits and incentives, those are certainly areas that could be explored by our policymakers. Other areas to think about when we look at hydrogen and renewable natural gas and their value in the market. The EPA has the RINs, which credits it for transportation, and California has the low carbon fuel standards, which credits low carbon fuels for transportation. can we find ways to actually credit hydrogen for other end use benefits? So that's really, what we want to think about is like, how can policymakers and regulators really kind of expand the opportunities to look at all the tools in the toolbox that are available, so to help us meet our decarbonization goals.
That's great. Thank you. And actually, what I wanted to turn my next question to Jack, because let's say we have a lot of these supportive policies, both on the state level and on the federal level. What volume of zero carbon hydrogen do you think the US could be producing, for example, by 2040? And do you think that could have a meaningful impact on our CO2 emissions?
Absolutely. And I want to refer the listeners to the US hydrogen roadmap that was developed by McKinsey recently, with support from a broad cross-section of the hydrogen industry, in which it is suggested that greater than 14% of total energy demand in the United States could be met with green hydrogen resources cost effectively in this timeframe, 2040 to 2050. Now, that might not sound like much, but the rest of it would be electrified or directly powered by sun and wind power in a way in which hydrogen would dramatically contribute to the overall carbon reductions. About 16% of the carbon emissions associated with our economy today could be reduced by this green hydrogen application. Importantly, greater than 30% reduction of nitrogen oxides, the primary pollutant for air quality concerns, would be also addressed by that use of same green hydrogen.
That was an excellent, very concise answer. Thank you so much. I now want to go, and I think this is reflecting a little bit of some of the questions we've been getting in the Q&A, is we're talking a lot about the percentage that hydrogen can do, and I'm going to Christine, and hydrogen blending and the possibilities there. But how do we get sort of pipeline operators, for example, and local gas utilities to actually increase these blending rates when their principal focus is on safety?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, Erin. So safety is absolutely a priority for natural gas utilities, safety for people, environment, and the infrastructure itself. But maybe just to provide some historical perspective around hydrogen blends, even dating back to the 1950s, before natural gas was really prevalent, we actually used town gas, which had up to 50% hydrogen. And this eventually phased out as natural gas supplies grew. But even now, Hawaii Gas has been delivering synthetic gas with up to 15% hydrogen since the 70s. So we do have some experience here within the US with regards to hydrogen blending. Now, there is a lot of work also happening in other parts of the world on hydrogen blending, especially in the UK and Germany. So I do think that we can leverage the learnings from these efforts and the pilot projects. So we aren't starting from scratch, but it's really important to note that we do have a different infrastructure here in the US versus that in Europe. And our infrastructure isn't uniform. So for example, the distribution pipelines in the Northeast are very different from those in the Southwest. And so it's important to account for those varying pipeline characteristics like age, material type, operating condition, geographic and environmental considerations when we're assessing the impact of hydrogen on a system. So we need to work together with the industry and the R&D community to really conduct the testing at multiple scales, to really validate the impact of hydrogen and determine the bounds and limitations of integrating it into our system, given a set of parameters and use cases that honestly is going to vary for each operator. And so we need to do this using a sound approach, evaluating both low hydrogen blends, but also considering, possible transitions to 100% scenario. And this applies not just to pipelines, but the entire gas network. So that's comprised of compressors, underground storage, M&R stations, customer meters. So I think if we're really committed to looking at hydrogen as being a part of our energy system, then we need to see this commitment in the form of research and technology investment from public and private entities so we can adequately address these challenges.
And Erin, can I add on to Christine's very good comments? I think it's really important to stress that a lot of utilities are very interested in these demonstrations and pilots. And that is why it's so essential that when we make these proposals with our regulators and our policymakers, that they understand how we need to understand our own network and what it can withstand. So currently with the NYSERDA project with Stony Brook University, we are really looking at our pipeline infrastructure. Is it 2%? Is it 10%? Is it 100%? We're also looking at National Grid UK, our parent company. They have a future grid project that is looking at 100% hydrogen blend in the pipeline network. So it's really essential for us to better understand and to collaborate, to have these public-private partnerships and to progress forward to really know what we can do.
That's great. And I also think it highlights that sometimes we think about having to adapt our entire system for hydrogen all at once, right? We sort of talk about it as a whole system, but what you've made clear is that we can sort of create these closed loop testing, right? And we don't have to think about this adoption of hydrogen on a system-wide basis, but we can test it in specific where it's most stable, where the conditions for it, and then go from there. So it can be this staged approach. I actually want to switch to Julio with a similar type of question, because you focused on the shipping side of things, and you've spoken before about airlines. Do you see, even as we see adoption perhaps picking up on the pipeline and utility level, do you think there might be some hesitancy from end users in those sectors, for example? And what do you think are ways that we could overcome those?
Thank you. Before I answer that question, let me speak just quickly on the last topic about what states can do. The states that have 100% renewable or clean energy power standards have an opportunity to try a bunch of stuff. And they can allow some of that to go into the rate case. And right now they don't. So that would help, because right now it's hard to actually pay for the research, the pilots, the demonstrations, anything else. A second thing, and this has been touched on, people forget how cost effective just data gathering and analysis is. Data gathering and analysis goes a long way. States can start a census of their existing pipelines to understand their metallurgy, their tolerances, their locations, all these kinds of things. They could start looking at issues of NOx. Like Jack said, that burning hydrogen under the wrong circumstance can increase NOx, but there are straightforward ways to manage that. A little bit of data analysis and research will go a long way and lead to a clean future. This gets actually back to your question, Erin, in the heart of it. For companies and sectors like steel or petrochemicals or shipping, they're dealing with a completely different world. They are trade exposed, they are emission intensives, and they are technically limited. Most people in this conversation start from the power sector, where there's lots of options and everything's used locally and it's heavily regulated. These other sectors are the exact opposite. And so what works in the power sector may very well not work for, say, cement manufacturers. And we shouldn't pretend that it does. There's a couple of things that are going to be important to get their adoption and buy-in. First and foremost, they need molecules. Until they have molecules, there's nothing happening. They're not going to build retrofits or design policies or anything else unless there's people making hydrogen. It's just not relevant in their world until that point. Because they are trade exposed, very small variations in price have a big difference in their world. A 5% difference in the power sector may not be a huge deal, but it is a huge deal to a steelmaker. And so they really need to have that sort of market aligning policy. Things like an output-based rebate or a border tariff is one way to manage that, but another way is a set of incentives that provide the molecules at cost parity. Reasonable people can disagree. But the most important thing for these guys is actually operational tolerances. A steel mill, a cement plant is running flat out all the time. A ship is running flat out all the time. They cannot lose time on efficiency, on retrofits, on downtime, all that sort of stuff. So there needs to be a focused research agenda to try to figure out how to quickly bring this stuff in and make sure that they get the performance they need in their business lines.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think you've really touched on some of the key questions. And I think we're starting to reflect some of the questions that have been coming up in the Q&A. And in the time, and because we have a number of them, I'm going to switch us over to looking at these audience questions. I apologize, we are not going to be able to address all of them here, but we will hopefully get through a fair number. I think I'm going to try to take some themes that I'm seeing and ask on those. And so the first one that Christine has been up to is a number of questions about sort of how thinking about corrosion of the natural gas pipeline system. How do we adapt the long distance transmission lines? Could you perhaps touch on the way that GTI is thinking about that? And maybe Jack, you also want to weigh in on some of the technical considerations for the blending and increased use of hydrogen in our system?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the transportation and delivery of hydrogen is another key challenge associated with just increasing supplies of hydrogen and delivering it to customers. Building new infrastructure is expensive, which is why I think we all agree we want to be able to leverage our existing gas infrastructure to deliver and store hydrogen, to the greatest extent that we can. And also, just as our system evolves, we need to find ways to continue using this massive infrastructure that we've built and all the investment that's gone in it. But as you noted, this really doesn't come without some technical challenges. So as we start to look at transporting other fuels, because our pipelines were built to transport natural gas, we need to do this in a really careful way, right? We need to understand the impacts to safety and reliability and integrity to the infrastructure. So at GTI, we're collaborating with industry, with companies like National Grid and Southern to really look at this issue around the impacts of hydrogen blending and on pipelines, and working with national labs to do this as well. So, just as important as looking at the impacts on maybe the pipeline materials itself, but also looking at the operational impacts, right? The safety implications. So we have ongoing work and research where we're determining safety factors for hydrogen systems, developing engineering tools for integrity assessments that pipeline operators already have to do for their existing systems, looking at what it means when you're blending hydrogen and its impacts on leak detection tools, for example, components such as meters, what does it mean for codes and standards, whether that's ASEM or CFR Part 192, but really trying to understand the full effects of hydrogen blending on the entire network. And that needs to be appropriately studied and evaluated.
I don't know, Jack, if you have comments as well.
Yeah, I just want to strongly support what Christine is highlighting, which is that there are probably a couple hundred issues that should be thoroughly evaluated and understood as we accomplish this transformation. But I want to make a couple of points that are at a higher level, and that is that the transformation of our gas system from what it is carrying today, fossil, to renewable fuels in the future is certainly going to be more cost-effective a solution for delivering the same sort of services of massive storage, underground delivery, resilience, and these kinds of features. Okay, it's going to be the cheapest solution possible. Okay, by transforming that system. Secondly, we already have parts of the system that we know are actually quite compatible, like the plastic pipe infrastructure in some of the distribution systems. And we could start with those sections and then piecewise, over time, over these next 30 years or so, transform other portions of it. And again, like Julio was saying, if we could put some of this into the rate base, okay, of the gas systems, then we have an opportunity to slowly transform that system over time. And we've looked at a number of the issues that Christine has talked about, like the embrittlement and the leakage and the gas detection things. And yes, we must understand that hydrogen's different, but we also know that there are solutions to make it safe and reliable as we transform this. The solutions are not rocket science. We already have pipelines that work for hydrogen. We already have detectors that work for hydrogen. We just have to make sure we transform the system to include those. Okay, so that's my suggestion.
I would just add another important note. I know Jack has worked on this issue as well, but we've talked a lot about the safety and integrity of the infrastructure, but we're also very focused on the customers as well. So when we look at blending maybe into a residential area, we're also looking at its impacts on existing appliances, right? Looking at low blends and looking at trends to increase that. But what does it mean? I think Jack was the one who highlighted kind of the issues that we may see just because we're blending hydrogen. It burns hotter, it's has a wider flammability range that's going to affect other performance characteristics of appliances, and we're doing that testing with industry. It's happening in the EU as well. So we want to be able to Julio's point, gather that data, get that information, and then do the modifications needed to enable the use of hydrogen.
That's great. Thank you. I'm actually, because I want to pick up on what you were saying there about on the UK, and I know Sherry, obviously National Grid is very much involved in the UK, and you mentioned this in your comments. The US is clearly we're behind what's going on, but what do you think in terms of, where do you see us in 5 years? And I'm also interested in sort of where do you see, and this ties into a question from one of our audience members, is do you think you could see hydrogen distribution on a commercial scale coming into, for example, Europe or Africa, Japan? Where could we see hydrogen first entering into that commercial scale? So sort of two-part question for you.
I'll start with the first part. Looking at our UK colleagues and the work that they're doing on hydrogen blending, we're learning a lot. We have regular conversations with them. In fact, National Grid just recently had a Future of Gas Investor Relations Day where our experts talked about the High Blend project and the High Street House and how they're really trying to effectively introduce 100% hydrogen into those locations. And as I mentioned, we have our own demonstrations and projects in place that we're looking at pushing forward. I will say that, hydrogen is definitely an area that we see emerging in the US Northeast and in other parts of the US as well. And talking to my colleagues in the EU, we really are kind of 5 years behind them. So it's interesting that the question is, where do we see ourselves in 5 years? 5 years ago, my UK colleagues tell me that it was electrify everything. That was the push. And however, the government and the stakeholders and public and private partnerships have emerged to see that hydrogen could meet that net zero ambition, really effectively mitigate climate change in their area. So I think what we need here is to have that same understanding, that same openness, that this is a viable option that's going forward around the world. And in the US, we need to also understand that that's a possibility here as well. And the only way we're going to get there is through conversations like this. Open dialogue, open discussions, educating, answering questions, being able to facilitate these kind of conversations with all kinds of stakeholders just so they understand where we're going. On the global aspect of where are we going to get hydrogen, I would probably defer to Julio because he would probably have a lot more expertise in that. I mostly focus on the policy side of things.
Yeah, if I may actually, specifically in terms of where we're going to get it from Europe, in the near term, I think you're going to be getting a lot of it from Northern Africa. There's going to be electric transmission lines coming into places like Italy and Spain. There's going to be electrolyzers set up there. In particular, SNAM in Italy, their pipelines are pretty well suited. They can get up to pretty high blend tolerances today. They can get up to 20 or 30% even. So for them, hydrogen supply and hydrogen delivery is an easier question. Same thing's true in Northern Europe. The electric grid in Sweden is already 80% carbon free. It's nuclear and hydro. They already have 3-cent electricity. So if they can make $2 a kilogram green hydrogen today, and they are. To Sherry's point, I would add that what Europe has recognized is one of the things I talked about, there are infrastructure limits, and that's a policy challenge. And I'm not talking about existing pipelines. They are putting money into ports. They are putting money into production facilities. They are putting money into CO2 storage sites. And all of that is to enable greater hydrogen production. And in part, it's because they've recognized they can't electrify everything, and there are things that they need hydrogen to do. I think, interestingly, Europe has also seen that this is an export manufacturing option for them. They can sell clean goods like steel. They can sell clean products like fuel cells. They can sell clean fuels like ammonia. And so they are configuring themselves to use hydrogen as a springboard into a lower carbon footprint manufacturing base, and that will enable them to be more competitive in a global world. And it will make it easier for them to consider options like border tariffs, which today they would be hard pressed to institute because of their high footprints.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of it at the angle of how they're viewing it as a sort of export advantage as well. That's a really interesting perspective.
In fact, let me just say, the countries that are farthest ahead on hydrogen are the ones that are really good at industrial policy, like Japan. They very much see it as an export opportunity.
Yeah, I would just add, so I appreciate the point that Julio brought up around, the economic competitiveness associated with hydrogen. So I think, as Sherry noted, we're 5 years behind probably from Europe. So, you know, the notion and the concept around having more of these public and private partnerships is really important, because as researchers, we absolutely want to develop technology solutions, but we need to see the funding and the commitment to do so.
So I'm going to touch on just another theme that I'm seeing, which is really around costs, and perhaps a little bit more of a discussion about the cost, particularly in terms of the electrolysis cost. And perhaps, Jack, maybe you can start us off on this, and any questions around water use, you know, during the electrolysis process. Perhaps you can touch on that a little bit.
Yes, on the cost, the main thing that goes into the electrolysis unit is renewable electricity from sun and wind power. And we know those costs have been coming down dramatically over the last a decade, especially. Then you have the electrolyzer itself, and electrolyzer costs are on a similar cost curve with a learning rate that's about 20% annually. And if you look at the potential market sizes that we could have in the future, there have been predictions of less than $1 per kilogram from renewable sun and wind power in through an electrolyzer to produce green hydrogen at less than $1 a kilogram. Now that's if we have a very large market, okay? But even at much smaller market sizes, we're getting down to the $2 per kilogram, which is directly competitive with SMR of a fossil today, when we have these larger markets. But as Julio suggests, we don't have that today, because electrolysis is very high up on the learning curve. We haven't built that many electrolyzer systems compared to the sun and wind power, which have come much further down that cost curve. So we know we can beat the fossil prices in the end, but we have to have a policy that enables massive adoption to get there.
So I agree with everything that Jack said, but I disagree in terms of many of the conclusions. And everything that he said, I think is fair and accurate, but I don't want people to necessarily believe that this is going to end up being cheap and easy. It will not. One of the important aspects of this is actually the duty cycles. So you can get a power purchase agreement right now for 2.5 cents of solar power in lots of parts of the world. That's great. That's only 25% capacity factor. In most parts of the world, that will not allow you to make cheap hydrogen. You need
Correct.
higher capacity factors. And even if the electrolyzer cost drops 50%, the cost of hydrogen drops like 12% or 15%. The electrolyzer is the small lever on this. So the rapid decrease in cost of electrolyzers is awesome and it's impressive. That is not going to deliver cheap green hydrogen alone. It can't. We need really, really cheap and really, really available zero carbon electricity sources. And it turns out that just one thing, kicking around numbers, the power purchase agreements that you're seeing with renewable energy, multiply by 1.4 to get an industrial price. And that's the point at which you're getting an industrial offtake contract for electricity. So
Yeah.
cheap industrial contract is more like 4 cents or 5 cents of electricity. At that price, it's very hard to make green hydrogen cheap today.
I agree. The analyses, though, do include the capacity factors, many times mixing some sun and wind so that you get higher use of the electrolyzer. The other thing I want to mention, hydrogen is more expensive to move around in society. So I was just talking about production price. So you're right that to deliver it to the customer still may involve a much higher price than the production price.
And where we're seeing high wind and solar combined, like in Western Australia, like in Western Saudi Arabia, like in Chile, we're seeing a lot of green hydrogen projects coming on for that very reason.
Exactly.
I actually had a question, especially in relation to the countries that you just mentioned, and again, tying into some questions we've been getting. Are there any concerns about water usage in terms of hydrogen production?
I want to use this one. Can I get this one, please?
You may.
No.
Okay.
Yes, you need high quality water to do electrolysis. Like you can't just take seawater or sump water. Like you really need very clean, pure water to do it. But the volumes of water that we're talking about are really small. Even in a really big hydrogen economy, you're talking about really small volumes of water totally. 1 million tons of hydrogen is like one frac job on a well. It's just not that much water.
Our analyses show exactly the same thing. Every time we've looked at this question, for example, we could meet all of the transportation demands of fuel as renewable hydrogen made from water in the state of California with less than 1% of the water that's moving in the California aqueduct today. And that's just one water source. Okay, so it always ends up being a small fraction of the water that we already move around in society today. Secondly, we get the water back. Okay, it's naturally returned to us when we make the electricity back in a fuel cell. Okay, so the earth can manage this.
So I'm glad we've answered that very definitively. I hope nobody has any questions remaining about that. The next question is, again, a few questions about the storage of hydrogen. Is there a preferable geology for hydrogen to be stored in, such as the salt, caverns, or is it a challenge? I mean, is storage a challenge for hydrogen? I mean, Jack, you obviously talked about the fact it's potential, but are there any challenges?
Cavern storage is proven. It's being done right now in the state of Texas at 2 different operating salt caverns, and the leakage from that is estimated to be not measurable. Okay, so it's a proven underground storage technology. Other underground resources still need to be studied a bit, like the depleted oil and gas fields. Those we don't know yet, and there might be some issues associated with that. But the massive storage potential that these offer is certainly worth investing in, seeing how we can put green hydrogen into these facilities as well.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think that's actually a research area that needs more investment, is the subsurface storage of hydrogen. And as Jack pointed out, it's a great potential to be able to use that massive storage capacity. So seeing more R&D in that space would definitely be beneficial.
I want people to get a sense of what salt storage gives you, though. I mean, first of all, there is salt geology around the country. There's salt geology in Pennsylvania, all on the Gulf Coast, in the Intermontane West. There's salt domes. So there's places where you can do this around the country. Second of all, the project that Jack was talking about, that one project in Utah where they're doing a salt cavern storage, that one cavern full of hydrogen has the energy capacity of 150 times all the batteries in the US. It's just huge.
Just
one salt cavern has the storage capacity of 150 times all of the US batteries. It is a massive, massive volume. And something like the strategic petroleum reserves, which are salt cavern storage for oil today, could potentially be reconfigured or retrofit to store hydrogen in the future. So there's ways to do this that are rational in the US context.
Thank you. I actually want to just switch to Sherry for a second in terms of thinking about customer end users. And we know we've talked a bit about the fact that hydrogen has lower heat value than natural gas, so you'll need a higher volume to deliver the same energy source. In terms of that and its costs, how are you thinking about that in terms of, as you start blending and increasing that for customers, how are you thinking of that in terms of customer bills, and perhaps how do we make sure this isn't something that ends up being a cost put on customers?
Yeah, customer affordability is top of mind at all times with our company. We're always thinking about how can we ensure that we have safe, reliable, affordable service for our customers and our communities. So with hydrogen, it's one of those areas that we have to explore to really understand what our pipes can currently withstand. Also, we have a really aggressive leak-prone pipe replacement program. So a lot of the recovery that we get currently within our rate cases and our regulatory proceedings is recovering investment that we're making in our infrastructure to ensure that it can provide that reliable service to our customers. So as we're thinking through and understanding what the capability of our pipeline infrastructure is, we'll also be thinking about like what are the costs and like what are the materials that we can utilize to ensure that we can get that blend rate. And if we only are going to go up to a 20% blend, maybe that won't require the customers to switch out their end use appliances. So there's a lot of things that we're thinking about with our customers, like what can we offer them? What can we do for them? But again, a lot of it's going to come down to incentivizing the hydrogen market. I mean, we've all spoken about that today. That's number one. Like, how are we going to bring down the cost? We've greened our electric system. Now it's time to green our gas network.
And I'm going to ask another question to you while I have you on, and just about how do you think, because it seems that there's some skepticism from the environmental community about hydrogen's part in, in the resiliency and our energy transition. How are you thinking about how do we bring, and I can open this up to all of you, but how do we, bring the environmental community along and stress the importance of hydrogen as part of reaching this decarbonizing future?
I think we just have to sit at the table and have a conversation. We have to collaborate. We have to educate one another. We have to listen. We have to learn. We have to move forward. It's not a conversation about passion. It's a conversation about science. It's not politics. It's the here and the now. It's looking at all the options that we can use with the technology that we have now, the technology that will be coming in the years to come. We have to have those conversations. If we just sit in our own silos and just argue about it, it's not going to happen. But it's really just sitting down and listening and having that conversation that is so key and essential, which is why I appreciate the panel today and just having this opportunity to have this discussion.
I would just add, I mean, the industry is already deploying solutions and technologies today to decarbonize, right? So I know National Grid is very aggressive in this space, but even if you look at integrating renewables, energy efficiency gains that we're making, right? Electrification in cases where it makes sense. But the reason we're looking at hydrogen is because we know that's not going to be enough. If we are striving to net zero by mid-century, it's not enough. And that's why we need to look at these low carbon fuels. So, we need an array of solutions to help us meet those goals.
If I could just add a little bit briefly, I completely agree with Sherry and Christine, like just engaging, being open, listening is sort of essentially and important. The topic of NOx came up earlier, and it's a good example. If you deploy hydrogen poorly, you might increase nitrous oxides emissions. It doesn't have to be that way. There's technical fixes, but you need to think about it. You need to talk to communities. You need to explain why what you're doing. You have to find ways to pay for it. All of that's work to be done. But if so, you can only reduce the carbon load, but other pollutant loads if you do it carefully and well. And by listening to those concerns, you can come up with better options. Similarly, from a justice perspective, hydrogen provides an opportunity for high wage. The unions like this a lot. AFL-CIO, steelworkers, boilermakers, like they're pretty enthusiastic about hydrogen. By the same token, though, if there are in fact community impacts, there are ways of pairing policies in a way that manages that. So for example, if you want to build hydrogen infrastructure, maybe you want to build hydrogen buses with it so that you decrease diesel emissions locally and perhaps provide last mile services as part of that to help families that have transportation needs. So there's a way to be proactive and positive in thinking about building the things that we need. And I think that starts with conversations like this one.
And I want to suggest that the very locations where people are most disadvantaged by exposure to pollution are those areas like heavy industry, ports, where hydrogen has the best potential to make those applications zero emissions. So, and I mean zero criteria pollutant emissions in addition to greenhouse gas emissions, especially using not just hydrogen, but hydrogen and fuel cell technology. If you put those together, I think you have a huge positive environmental impact you can have, especially in disadvantaged communities.
That's great. And I'm actually I'm just trying to sort of make sure we touch on the questions in terms of adoption and everything else, but somebody asked, and maybe Sherry, you'd be the person to ask about this. Do you think there are certain states, because as we think about policies again, that are really helping to encourage hydrogen use in state, in their state policy? Like, what would be good examples of states that you think are at the forefront of this?
I can say in the Northeast, there are definitely, like within our 3 states, they're all open to it. The conversations are happening. They are looking at hydrogen as a pathway, primarily for industrial uses. In Rhode Island, we had the heating sector transformation where they talked about decarbonization of gas, and hydrogen was most fit in their estimation for industrial uses. Within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there was a pathways report that came out from our environmental agency in late December that looked at hydrogen as a path, again, for industrial uses. I would say that New York is really pushing forward on this. Again, NYSERDA's openness and partnership that we have with them, they're really locked in on the technology drivers and the challenges and the opportunities for hydrogen. So I'd say within the Northeast, New York is really progressing in an active way.
And I'll take it to another state that's come up recently, and perhaps Christine, you can speak to this if you're able, or any of them. We've had a couple of questions on what experience that we've seen in Texas over the last week. How does that inform how we're thinking about or how the US should be thinking about hydrogen and what role it could play?
Yeah, so I think the key message here is we do need a diversity of energy sources to provide the deliverability and reliability to our customers, and especially in the state of Texas, because there are a lot of existing assets and infrastructure that we could leverage around the port. I mean, we've talked about the discussions around, developing these industrial hubs around ports. You see that happening in Texas around the Port of Houston, but being able to leverage those assets so we can start building out what that hydrogen economy is going to look like is really important. So we have studies that are addressing that. There are a lot of other organizations and stakeholders looking at that model where they're doing it in Europe and in other places. So I just think trying to advance that and having the programs to help support the creation of these types of hydrogen hubs or networks to help accelerate the adoption and technologies is really important.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions about the transportation side of things, and perhaps Jack, I'll start with you on this. And you had talked about how hydrogen is suited for heavy duty trucks and batteries for passenger vehicles. What are you thinking in terms of like mid-size vehicles, light trucks, UPS trucks, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so hydrogen has its advantage over batteries when you need rapid fueling, long range, or heavy payload. But it might also have very significant infrastructure advantages that would lead to its use also in light duty applications like you're talking about. And what I mean by that is if you have to make all transportation zero emissions, okay, it's very difficult to deliver all of that electricity to urban environments as electricity. And again, you would have to upgrade the grid so much to deliver all that energy, and because people will be charging at the same time anyway and everything, that it's not going to be as cost effective as doing some of that and the rest with hydrogen. So, and you can imagine this in your own neighborhood, right? If you have 20% of your neighborhood that owns a Tesla and charges at night, it's fine. But if you have 100%, you have to upgrade the grid very substantially. So I want to just make a suggestion that there will be hydrogen and battery use in transportation, and batteries are the best for round trip efficiency. And if you have short trips and don't mind charging a long time, this is the very best thing you should do. Keep doing that. But then where you can't do that with the heavy payload or rapid fueling or long range, then you can use hydrogen as the alternative zero emissions vector.
If I could augment that just a little bit, I'm very much influenced by the work of one of the Columbia professors here, Dan Steingart, who's an international class battery expert. Part of the issue is actually just the cost of batteries. For a car, cost of battery is $5,000. That is totally in bounds for what a family might choose to pay for. Battery costs for a truck are between $60,000 and $90,000. That's a completely different cost estimate in terms of thinking about how to do this. These things have to get into it. If we learned anything from Texas recently, it's again that lots of options and resiliency are important. Moving to an all-electric fleet means that if the grid goes down for 5 days, nobody has cars or heat or electricity. So that's potentially problematic. Again, there's ways to fix that with analysis, with investment, with resilience. There's good things to do, but I can't be cavalier about that. If there's any one thing I would wish in terms of current investment in thinking about transportation, so forth, it's again, data and analysis. Let's get some information out there, figure out what would be useful. Because at this point, we're just having screeching from competing lobbyists. We need a little more information, I think, to figure out what constitutes a good investment and in what contexts. I think the investments Amazon's making with Rivian are pretty useful. Like they've got electric trucks and vans, and that seems to be working really well for them. It's not going to be the case ubiquitously. And for a country like Japan, they're going to do a mix of batteries and hydrogen for light duty vehicles. They've already made that bet and they're doing it. It seems to be working for Japan. So I don't want to be monotonic about this response. We don't know really enough to figure out how the market's going to value this stuff or where it's going to go.
Christine, I didn't know if you wanted to.
So I was just, as I'm listening to the remarks from Jack and Julio and listening to the discussion, I think what this highlights is, yeah, we are focused on hydrogen in this panel discussion. We have solutions that we want to implement, but we can't look at it with blinders on, right? It needs to fit into this holistic integrated energy system. So when we talk about all these solutions, we have to understand how it all integrates together and how it can work together to make sure that we are providing reliable energy to a whole set of stakeholders and customers. So I think that integration piece is really important.
And can I just touch on the Texas customer perspective? Because I'm a Texas transplant to New England. I just moved here about 2 years ago and lived my entire life in Texas. And I will say, just from a personal aspect, like from a consumer standpoint, the majority of my friends and family who are undergoing the 4 days without power or water, the majority of them were relying upon their natural gas burning stoves, their gas burning fireplaces, and their gas water heaters. And but for that, they were experiencing temperatures 32 degrees in their homes with small children with different disability levels. So it was heart-wrenching to hear from them what they were going through, but I was happy that they had a resource that was available and reliable that they could utilize during that time to cook for their families and to heat their homes and to ensure that they were safe.
And I think that ties in very much to the resiliency, right, and reliability that Jack was talking about in his opening remarks. And that's a really excellent point. I wanted to just go back because we've been talking very much about the green hydrogen has been predominantly a lot of this conversation, but there are some questions here about blue hydrogen. What is the role? What do we see for it? Should we be thinking of leapfrogging and going right to green? How important is blue hydrogen? And I'm opening it up to whoever wants to go first.
Oh, I'm very keen to take the first whack on that one. I think we can take a lesson from Europe on this and Frans Timmermans at the EU. They have acknowledged straight out of the gate that blue hydrogen is important too, period. And right now, there are 12 facilities around the world that make blue hydrogen at scale. There are no facilities around the world that make green hydrogen at scale. So if you want speed and volume, blue hydrogen can go. Also, you have to build a new green hydrogen facility. You can retrofit an existing gray hydrogen facility. So there's opportunity to take existing assets and decarbonize them very rapidly. Third of all, and this is no news to anybody, some parts of the world got great renewable resources and some don't. And if you don't have great renewable resources, green hydrogen is not necessarily a good solution for you. In contrast, at a place like the Gulf of Mexico or Alberta, Canada, which has super cheap natural gas and great CO2 storage, you're going to be able to make blue hydrogen there for like $1.20 or $1.50. It's going to be really cheap. And if the issue I said before, companies need molecules before they can get going, blue hydrogen is the fast path to making molecules. Inevitably, I believe that the world will transition completely away from blue. Inevitably, the future is going to be just green hydrogen with zero carbon electricity. But that might be 2050, it might be 2070, it might be 2100, we don't know. And until then, focus on the carbon. Net zero is the right framework. And in a net zero framework, blue hydrogen is hugely, hugely valuable.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think in the short, medium, and maybe even long term, we need to look at blue hydrogen to really spur that growth. And it's, 95% of hydrogen today is made from natural gas. So we need to continue using that asset. And if we look at from the cost perspective, as Julio highlighted, it is going to be cheaper even when you add on carbon capture relative to what we're seeing with regards to green hydrogen prices.
And these are real carbon reductions. I agree with everything Julio said. I was going to add that we eventually phase out of blue, okay? But you already said that.
It's terrifying to have that degree of alignment.
I know, we'll try to create some more conflict. I actually had a question about going long term, because we were talking 2070 and 2100 came up. So this ties into the question of, let's say we get to a point of mass hydrogen adoption. Could we totally avoid carbon fuels, or do we hit that? Is there a limit, do you think we hit at some point?
So let me make a suggestion that in some applications like the ships or the aircraft, there probably will be a need for higher energy density fuels. And as a result, we might need to make hydrocarbon fuels by air capture or by biogenic sources of CO2 and renewable hydrogen that we synthesize into these hydrocarbon fuels, so that there is going to be, I think, some remaining cycling of carbon through our energy infrastructure for these high energy density needs.
It's great. And I assume everybody is in agreement? Okay.
Yep, totally.
I would actually, and this is a good question that somebody brought up, because we talked about the state regulators, we talked about what the administration could do. Is there anything that FERC could do? And maybe Sherry, you can speak to this. Do we see FERC having a role here in promoting hydrogen use? And if so, what would it be?
I haven't heard of FERC expressing an interest in hydrogen yet, but I have heard that there are conversations about renewable natural gas, which is another low carbon fuel. So maybe there are opportunities there to kind of blow that out and actually look at all low carbon fuels and other options. So that's certainly something that could be brought to light under the new administration.
And another technical question I'm getting is a couple, maybe we'd have to just expand a bit on this, is sort of the difference in the hydrogen molecule and that it tends to be leakier. So how are we thinking about this in terms of, at a residential level, and how is that going to have a factor?
So we've done some research in this area, and as a matter of fact, just published a paper recently that suggests that in existing low pressure gas infrastructure, hydrogen leaks at the same rate as methane. And there are good physical reasons to expect that. Under certain leak circumstances, though, hydrogen will leak faster. Those are circumstances under which you have very large leaks, and hydrogen can slip through those leaks very much more quickly. But when you have the molecular dynamics of interacting with, let's say, threaded pipe fittings, then it doesn't leak any faster. And so there's some research that still has to be done with regard to all the kinds of potential leaks you could have, like at valve stems and things like this. But I suggest also that this is a manageable problem. It's not a physically difficult thing to overcome once you find that it leaks a little bit faster under these circumstances. You can fix those kinds of things with relatively inexpensive technology.
Yeah, and I would just add, we know that there can be an issue, but there are technologies and solutions that can be deployed, right? I mean, there's existing hydrogen sensors and analyzers that can be used. So maybe that means that, operations have to change in terms of conducting leak surveys or leak detection methods. But, that's just a part of being able to adapt and modify our existing system.
That is actually that's very helpful. We're having some questions, and we've talked a lot about in the green hydrogen side of things. We've talked about solar, wind, and then there are some questions about how important a role is nuclear in delivering green hydrogen? So I just want us to touch on that too.
So let me just take a second here and whack at the hydrogen rainbow a little bit. People talk about brown hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, teal hydrogen, pink hydrogen, yellow hydrogen, gray hydrogen. Enough of this. Does the electricity have carbon? If the answer is yes, it's bad. If the answer is no, it's green. Is it a carbonaceous feedstock? Yes. If the answer is yes, is it venting CO2? It's gray. If it's not venting CO2, it's blue. Can we just get rid of the rest of that? So zero carbon electricity of any point is welcome, and zero carbon electricity can generate zero carbon hydrogen through electrolysis. Here, the issue with nuclear is flatly cost. That's the big problem. And it is high capacity factor. It's reliable. We know how to build these things. We know how to scale them. Today, we're talking about 10 cents a kilowatt hour for new nuclear facilities. And that's just tough. It's just really, really hard. The place where I see nuclear playing the most important role is actually in the existing fleet of nuclear plants and as we begin to add renewables onto the grid. In the case of the state of New York, we had 18% curtailment of nuclear power as we added more renewable electricity. That's just nuclear energy we weren't using. We could have been making hydrogen with that. And so if there's a way, in fact, for nuclear plants to be able to provide additional support, especially as we add more renewable in, then that will make it easier to contract the production of hydrogen. Again, thinking about New York, we're going to see this particularly happen when offshore wind comes online. And we get this big ramp up of offshore wind resources. It's going to stress the nuclear plants even more. If they could have load centers in hydrogen production, that could help a lot of people.
I think that's one of the things. We need dispatchable renewable electricity. We need some controllable levers, either on the load side or on the generation side. And this is where nuclear could, together with electrolysis, deliver some of those features.
Thank you. I have one question that's come up a couple times, so I'm going to ask that as well. I'm just trying to we have only 2 minutes left. So just a question about in electrolysis, when we split the oxygen and the hydrogen, what happens to the oxygen?
If you're smart, you capture it and sell it.
Yeah. You have an adjacent customer that likes the oxygen. That's what you should do. Most of the time in existing projects, though, it is vented.
An example of a good application, by the way, is you could make green hydrogen on site of, say, a steel mill. You could run the hydrogen in as a fuel, and you could use oxygen to prime the blast furnace. And that would get you higher efficiency and better use of all the resources. And the same thing's possible
Absolutely.
in chemical plants.
Absolutely. There's also a wastewater treatment potential use. So you could actually lower your aeration costs for the sewer that's coming into the plant by using pure oxygen or a mixture of oxygen and air, and dramatically lower the cost of operating a wastewater treatment plant.
I'm also happy to open
lots of other possible oxygen uses.
And I think that Jack and I are already committed to creating a line of oxygen bars, which will open up near hydrogen facilities. So
my graduate student did that, and he said it didn't help at all.
Well, we are 1 minute from the end, so I am going to wrap up because I wish I could. I honestly wish this panel could keep going for another hour. It has just been fascinating, and I really thank you all because you've given us, I think, a very clear outline of what the challenges are and how we can overcome them, and debunking, I think, some of the common questions that come up surrounding hydrogen adoption. So I really want to thank you again for joining us. And I also want to thank our audience who have joined us from around the world today and stayed with us and for asking so many wonderful questions. And as we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. Our next event, Columbia Energy Straight Talk with Cheryl LaFleur and David Hill. The topic is What Makes Policy Change Successful, will be held on Thursday, February 25th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And so if you would like a full calendar of our upcoming events, visit the Center on Global Energy Policy, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.